Dear guests, welcome to our program. Apologies, we start a couple of minutes of late. We are, as Harvard Business Review, we are continuing to bring you together with distinguished thought leaders within Turkey and outside of Turkey. Today, we will be discussing a very timely and important topic, decision-making through the tough times. Before we start, I would like to remind you that this stream is broadcasted live on Instagram, Twitter, and YouTube simultaneously. So we gather the questions via YouTube chat bar. If you want to ask questions, please join us on our YouTube channel. Today, I'm proud to host a globally recognized thought leader on decision-making. Max Bazerman is a professor of business administration at Harvard Business School with a special focus on decision-making, behavioral economics, and negotiations. Very recently, Max co-authored a book, a marvelous book, if I may say, The Power of Experiments with Michael Luca. Without further ado, I would like to kick off our conversation. Welcome to the program, Max.
Why, thank you. I'm delighted to join you.
I always start with the same question with all our guests. So how are you affected with this COVID-19 incident?
So certainly my life is different. Among the changes are teaching online and spending many hours a day interacting with people through the computer like we're doing now. But I've also been teaching my MBA class online, and so this is all a new learning experience for me. So there are many new things about the way I do my work. At the same time, I'm fortunate in that I'm protected. I'm relatively safe. I'm at home with my wife and with my dog. We have plenty of food, and I'm healthy. So overall, I'm not experiencing the dreadful effects that so many others are, but certainly the way I go about my work is quite different than it was just a few months ago.
Yeah, I totally understand. It's much more same here. We are also broadcasting this via our digital studio, but remotely. So lots of things have been moved to remote access and remote working, and we will see how this will affect the future of work and workforce. We'll see. But when I am talking about, or when I'm thinking about what we are going through with this COVID thing, one question always pops in my mind. Can we anticipate this? Did we overlook this? What do you think? Well, according to your opinion and according to your research, can we anticipate this coming?
So I think that we did anticipate something like this coming. So if you ask, could we have predicted exactly this? Perhaps not. Similarly, if we go back to the 9/11 tragedy, could have we predicted that these buildings would have been hit by airplanes? Perhaps not those buildings, but there were lots of hints available that we should have been doing many more activities to prevent a related activity from occurring. So in the current pandemic, there were many hints that this kind of virus-like crisis could occur, the specific nature of which we didn't know. And early in the Trump presidency in the United States, he eliminated the pandemic unit within the government. So when the virus did hit, we were less prepared for dealing with it. In addition, when we had hints, and obviously the virus hit China long before it hit Turkey or the US or other countries. When it hit China, we certainly could have anticipated that some people are going to travel, and we already knew that this virus could spread very, very rapidly. So I think that our biggest failures had to do with the slow speed at which we reacted once we knew that a very, very serious virus was occurring in Wuhan, China. So could we predict this? Not exactly far in advance. Could we predict something like this far in advance? Absolutely. Could we predict the terrible events that are occurring once the virus broke in China? I think that the answer is yes, and I think too many of our leaders failed to respond with adequate speed.
Right. So I am familiar with your concept of predictable surprises. So is this event a kind of a predictable surprise?
So I think that a virus of this type was predictable. The particular details less so. And once the events existed in China, I think that the likely spread throughout the globe was much more predictable and should have been responded to by leaders around the globe. And many of our leaders were amazingly slow at responding for basically, I would describe a leadership failure in many of the countries across the globe.
Right. As much as I remember, when I go back and read the risk reports for 2020, most of the prominent risk reports, the ones that are published in World Economic Forum at Davos, for instance, this year, they somehow anticipate that there is going to be a infectious disease going through, but the probability of it is seen as low. So I think as humans, we are not very much prepared to low probability events.
I think that that's right, Sridhar, and so I think that you have it exactly right. Lots of forecasters had predicted an infectious-like disease spreading at some point in the not too distant future. We didn't know it would be 2020. We didn't know the details of the nature of the virus, but we should have been prepared for thinking about how will we react when this kind of event occurs. And in that way, I think that we really did fail. We failed at being prepared with adequate supplies. We failed in terms of being adequately connected across, for example, in the United States, we're not well organized across states. We have states competing with each other at a global level. We have countries competing with each other for the same supplies. So rather than having a coordinated response where the resources are used where they're most needed, we have competition for very limited supplies in many cases.
Right. And the times that we are going through are not easy times. They are very uncertain and ambiguous times, if I may say. And during these times, it is not easy to make the best decisions, I guess. So how could leaders make better decisions throughout these uncertain times that we are going through?
Sure. So I think that there's a variety of things that leaders can do both before a crisis occurs and in the midst of the crisis. Before the crisis occurs, we certainly want to be better prepared. So we basically want to think through what would we do in the event of a coronavirus-like activity. And I think that we failed miserably on that front. So we can simply be better prepared. I think when the crisis does hit, we could value experts. So I think that the medical experts got this right early on in the crisis, and too many of our leaders failed to pay attention to the experts. They didn't value science enough. They weren't very transparent. They were affected by overconfidence. The president of my country made repeated comments saying that this virus was not a problem, that we have it under control, that it's not going to affect the U.S., and not that many weeks later, the U.S. is being affected perhaps to a larger degree than any other country in terms of absolute numbers. So we see a variety of leadership mistakes in terms of how my country and other countries have responded once the crisis was on our doorstep.
How about business leaders? Now, lots of businesses are also caught unprepared to this certain time. And now people are just trying to understand what way they should take. So this brings them very different and very serious decision points. So as business leaders, how can we have better decision-making mechanisms throughout this uncertain times?
Terrific question, Sudar. And it's a tough question, and the answer has to vary based on the nature of the specific business. But broadly, I think that leaders are confronted with two tasks. One is, how do you survive so that your business still exists 6 months from now? And certainly I'm in touch with many organizations where there's a very real threat that the organization will not exist 6 months from now. So thinking about cash flow, how do you keep your employees still working for you? What do you do about the fact that you have rent payments while you're not able to use your building? These are all questions that need to be dealt with in the very short term. But I think leaders need to also have the vision to be thinking about the next 3 years, to think about assuming we can survive, what happens between September 2020 and September 2022, and how are we going to regrow the business? And while many leaders are in lockdown, they're at home, and they don't have all of their ordinary activities to deal with, they do have time to be thinking about what does a reimagined version of this organization look like. And I think that this is a fantastic time for leaders to use their downtime to re-engage and to reimagine what business would look like. So as I'm talking to you, Sudar, you're in the publishing business, but all of a sudden you're interacting with me in this new online format that wasn't that common just 3 months ago. I think you're doing exactly the kind of activity that leaders need to think about. What does my organization look like moving forward, rather than how do I restore the past?
Right. So when it comes to strategical decisions, is there a kind of a framework or a checklist that we can use as business leaders to see if we are doing our duty right?
So I don't think that I have a great checklist to say, here's 6 steps to always follow. But I think that there are some ideas that we could borrow from. One I've just suggested, we need to take, in addition to dealing with getting through the crisis, we need to take a long-term perspective. Now's a great time to tap into the creativity of the rest of your organization. Many of us have employees who we aren't using all of their capacity, and many of us have more capacity because of the lockdown. So I'm working more hours than normal, not less hours than normal, because I'm locked down at home. And leaders can learn from the other people in their organization. What are the opportunities out there? How could you envision what our organization would look like 3 years from now that would be better, not worse, than what it's looked like in the past? I'm in an industry called academia, and we're clearly going through some fundamental change. And multiple years ago, people talked about education going online, but all of a sudden we find ourselves, we are online. And many of us did our personal movement online in the last 2 months. But now I think universities around the globe are thinking about what does education look like in 2022, 2025, 2030. And we could imagine using our new technical skills that can enhance the quality of education throughout the globe, rather than viewing it simply as a loss because we can't do things the way we've always done it in the past.
Right. Just before this COVID crisis, I think for the last 3 or 4 years, if I may say, the business ecosystem is becoming aware of behavioral economics, behavioral sciences. We have been seeing much more psychological approaches. We have been seeing nudging coming to life, both in policy and both in business. So I think with this event, we are seeing how strong behavioral effects and biases or heuristics are on people, on consumers, on policymakers. So what's your take on that? How the behavioral science may help us to better understand what's going on?
So I think that this story is going to be the pivotal story that we're going to see as a leadership episode in books for the next decade. So this is not like the Great Recession. This is not like 9/11. This is the pivotal event of my lifetime. And there's so many things that we can observe in how leaders have responded that will become the opening story of articles and books moving forward. And I think that that's certainly true in the behavioral economics realm that you're talking about, because we can see biases jumping out at us based on the behavior of many leaders. So Donald Trump has exhibited one of the core biases of behavioral economics more dramatically than I can think of in any other story. So his overconfidence in his ability to manage a crisis has been just enormous. And this is not original to my research. We can read this in the media. Lots of sources in the media have cataloged the enormous number of statements where he's exhibited overconfidence. And this is not just a bias that's an interesting story. His overconfidence kept the United States from responding earlier and containing the virus. And the fact that we have more cases than any other country, and at this point more deaths than in any other country, is in significant part due to the overconfidence of our leaders. So we see overconfidence kind of in a quite dramatic degree. I think that earlier we were talking about taking a long-term perspective for leaders. One of the biases that we talked about in behavioral economics is present bias, which essentially means giving insufficient thought to the future. And I think that a lot of leaders are trapped in present bias because of the need to think about survival and the immediate demands of getting through the next 2 months. But I think leaders who only think about getting through the next 2 months may well survive the next 2 months, but find themselves in a weakened position to grow in the future. And that's why I think that they need to think to the long term. So from overconfidence to present bias to, in many cases, I read about a lot of optimism. These are some of the kinds of behavioral economic events that really jump out as a result of the current crisis.
So do you recommend business leaders to bring a behavioral economist to their decision-making teams?
Of course. I think that we want to bring wisdom to our teams, and through whatever mechanism, whether leaders reading more or using expertise or benefiting from the people around them, we want to create more rationality in our decision making, and we want to figure out how to get our biases away from our decisions as much as we possibly can.
How can we do it? Is it going to be a top-down approach throughout these days, or is this going to be something like collaborative or bottom-up kind of a thing? I know you are in favor of roundtable decision-making models, so maybe it will fit to that.
Yes, so a number of comments. It's going to happen lots of different ways. So if I think about the United States, again, you've just heard my criticism of our amazingly slow response to deal with COVID and the many thousands of deaths that resulted from our slow response. So I'm being very clear about that. But we can also look at various governors of the states within the United States who responded much more quickly. So when we see a dramatically more effective response to COVID in California than we do in other states, that's because of the early action of leaders. So I'm not sure whether you want to call the states sort of a lower level of the organization, but it's certainly not at the level of the nation. And we see wisdom coming from that kind of level. Similarly, I think that business leaders can and should tap into the expertise of people around them. I think leaders should be careful not to be overconfident. That they know the right answer of how we should move forward, and they should tap into the expertise that they can easily access. You mentioned the concept of roundtable, and this is basically the idea of how do you organize a group of your top management team so that you can access all of their ideas rather than the top leader simply telling everyone else what she thinks and then influencing everyone else before you get a chance to hear their independent voices. And we know how to manage a group process so that we can get the very best ideas out of everyone rather than having everyone trying to appease what the top leader wants everyone else to say. So the more we can take politics out of the process and focus on how do we find the wise decision for the organization, the more likely it is that we're going to develop strategies that will get us through the crisis and, more importantly, thrive over the years that follow.
Okay, a couple of questions arrived. I think it's good time to ask them to you. One of our readers is asking, what is the biggest challenge for academia in the coming years?
It's a terrific question, and obviously one that I think a lot about. So, and I may be, biased by knowing American universities better, but, one of the things that I've always enjoyed so much about academia is that we've been truly terrific at developing a global way of interacting. So my students come from all over the globe, and that's true in our executive programs, but it's also true in our MBA program, in our doctoral programs, and a fundamental challenge in the short term is sort of what do we do with the MBA students who are supposed to show up in September for year 2, some of whom may be in countries where they have a problem getting a visa to even return to Harvard. So how do we deal with the challenge of getting people to the right place at the right time? And if we can't, how are we going to run a classroom and help these members of our community complete their education in some alternative form? So many universities, excuse me, are thinking about, might we be online this coming fall? Is it possible that we need to learn how to teach in a blended classroom where there's 60 people in front of you, but another 30 people who are online and yet are part of the class? So how do we recreate this educational experience and meet the needs of many of our constituencies? So these are the challenges that we're currently confronting. And like other businesses, we need to plan for these kinds of problems, not knowing whether the virus is going to be whether the virus situation will be dramatically better in 6 weeks or whether this is going to extend for a longer period of time. So the decision making throughout academia is fluid, but certainly figuring out how nations work better with each other so that we can solve visa problems rapidly is going to be part of the challenges that academia faces moving forward.
Another question is about the supply chain, because this event also proved that we had a very fragile global supply chain to a certain extent. So what's your take on supply chain manufacturing and sourcing strategies? Are you expecting a significant change in those globally networked strategies?
Sure. So to back up, I'm a big fan of free trade and free trade agreements. And I think that one of the reasons that the world economy has done so well is the ability to allow different countries that do different things better to trade with each other. And countries that trade with each other don't go to war with each other very often. There's just an enormous number of benefits of free trade. But certainly, as barriers to free trade go up, partially as a result of some of our leaders having a very myopic view, and partially as a result of the COVID crisis. I expect that more and more leaders are going to think about their supply chain on how do we guarantee that we have the supply of the critical resources that we need, and that may mean looking for more suppliers within our national bounds. And I think that that's unfortunate, but I certainly expect to see some of that occur. I would love to see international organizations be working on this to figure out how do we keep supply chains open and moving even during a very difficult time. So one of the supply chain issues is who gets the vaccines when they come online, who gets the limited ventilators, who gets the masks, and better coordination across countries would be kind of a terrific thing for saving more lives worldwide, and I think that that's crumbling. And if anything, we see many leaders who basically say, don't send any product outside the country. We want it just for us. And those leaders often fail to think about the fact, but we're buying supply parts for those products that we won't sell outside from overseas. And if we basically put up barriers to selling our products to other people, the suppliers of the products to us may close down as well. So we need to have a broader perspective and think through the whole supply chain rather than just sort of who are we willing to buy from, who are we willing to sell from. And like other advocates of free trade, I certainly believe that we should lean toward more openness rather than closing the doors at the first sign of crisis.
Right. As much as I see, we have just pushed the system to its limits in favor of efficiency and created some fragility throughout the supply chain. There are lots of interesting examples where an apparel, for instance, is produced in United States, then it's sent to China just for the zipper to be added to that apparel, and then it comes back to China, to United States just for a couple of cents of cost reduction. So these kind of pushing the limits actions have created a fragility in the system, and I think it's a good time for us to rethink or revisit those fragilities and fix them if we may.
I certainly agree with you, and I can certainly imagine that companies doing a better job of having 2 or 3 suppliers for the same critical input rather than one, so that if you lose one critical supplier because of trade barriers or because of a crisis like COVID, that you have other suppliers that you can draw on. So I think that we're going to have a variety of different strategic responses. But what I fear more is that authoritarian leaders are going to close down, are going to put up walls to trade that are going to have tremendous implications that need not occur in a wise post-COVID environment.
Yeah, one of the things we have witnessed is that the medical supplies, devices, ICU units, ventilators, really nations and countries competed for them, and even they pushed the limits of ethicality and fairness in order to source these kind of things. Does your research on decision making bring any insight about how we can better allocate these kind of crucial resources?
Absolutely. So, again, from a U.S. perspective, and I apologize for highlighting the U.S., but it's examples that I may know better. A more extreme version of what you just said is we have our 50 states competing with each other within the United States for limited resources. So we have states competing within the country. We have countries across the globe competing. And what we should be doing is saying, how do we use our limited resources to contain this virus so that less people are affected? Where is the need the most, rather than how do I protect mine and not worry about yours? Most ethical perspectives highlight the more global our perspective, the more ethical our decisions will be. And the more we decide that my group, whether it's my family or my religion or my state or my country, the more we focus on a narrow definition of the problem, the more lives we're going to kill in a crisis like COVID. So I think we need a broader perspective. In terms of the international form of your question, I would hope that international agencies could have more influence on government. But again, we have authoritarian leaders who are basically telling the World Health Organization, don't tell us what to do, we'll go our own way. And I think that that's a true tragedy. I think it's an ethical violation. And we can hope for wiser leaders in the future. And one can certainly imagine that the poor leadership we see in many countries during the COVID crisis will affect a number of democratic elections in the years to come.
And there is another really good question from the audience. The question reads like this. When will people forget all of these things as they forget many things that happened before? So you know that you are just expert on those kind of biases. So one of the biases we can talk about is the status quo bias, where we would like to go back to our normal. So will people forget this and go back to normal, or we will be seeing a different future?
I think we're going to be seeing a different future. So I appreciate the question, and I think it is true that when you're in the midst of most crises, you overestimate how important that event will be and how much it's going to change the world. But I'm predicting that this crisis is simply different, that this is going to be the most pivotal moment in my life so far. So I'm 64 years old, and so I've been through, the Vietnam War as a young person. I was not in the military, but I observed the Vietnam War as a young person. I saw 9/11, I saw the Great Recession, and this is affecting the behavior of individuals. This is affecting supply chains. This is affecting whether or not companies are going to survive to a degree that we've never seen before. We would certainly need to go back to the Great Depression for a altering event of this magnitude. So while I appreciate the question that we may overemphasize the moment, in fact, I think that we're going to have a slow recovery. I certainly expect us to recover, but I think the recovery is going to be slower. I think our supply chains are going to be disrupted because you're going to have organizations in Turkey who need products from Spain, and the Spain organization won't be up and running, so the Turkish organization won't be able to make its product. And so we're going to see disruptions for so many years to come. People are going to recall the time that they spent multiple months at home under some form of lockdown. We just haven't seen this before. I think it will be the pivotal moment of many of our lives.
A couple of other questions that I would like to address. One of them is, how about the impacts on the purchasing power of consumers? Are the production costs expected to rise, when as the purchasing power expected to drop? So there is going to be a perfect storm. Costs are rising, the purchasing power is going down. Do you see that kind of a scenario?
I think it's going to vary by product. So I think that there are some products where production has continued, and we're going to have an oversupply of production. And the prices are going to stay down for a long period of time. On the other hand, there's going to be other products that are in extraordinary high demand, and the production system simply can't make them fast enough. And so if we look at the sort of the current environment, we see the price of oil collapse. So basically, the production has continued without the demand for that production, so the prices collapse. Meanwhile, ventilators and masks, the prices has gone up. There are a variety of scarce grocery supplies where the price has gone up quite dramatically. So I think that to think about the nature of the supply-demand characteristics and the impact on price, we need to think about the specific products that we're talking about, and we're going to see the full range of changes in prices. I think the world is going to be shifted quite dramatically, but it's not going to be simply prices are going up or down.
Yeah. Another question is about the perspective of the leadership. What will be the new normal for result orientation and the agility concept for leaders?
Yeah, so I've long viewed it as a mistake when leaders say I reward results. So saying I reward results misses the fact that we make decisions under uncertainty. And sometimes you make a good decision that comes out poorly, and sometimes you make a poor decision that comes out well. It's important that we focus on leading people to wise decisions rather than simply taking a look at whether something worked or something didn't work. We need to think through what kind of decision is most likely to get us positive results across a portfolio of decisions rather than focusing on whether a specific outcome occurred in one specific context.
And another question is about working from home. Some people really experience this thing in a very bitter way because it's like compulsory working from home. But are we going to see more and more remote working models, and will we be working more and more from home?
I think that the answer is yes, because we're all learning how to do it. So the fact that I now know how to meet with people on Zoom, and I know how to teach a class on Zoom or whatever other platform you like, means that there are times we're going to realize that there are more and more times when we don't have to be in the office. So I expect to see remote work continuing for many people. Obviously, it's very task specific, and many of us have jobs where we can't work at home. But for those of us who do a variety of tasks where if communication allowed, we could stay at home, we're going to see, I think, we're going to see a dramatic shift. This is exactly the kind of thing that I was referring to earlier, in terms of COVID creating a dramatic shift rather than a mild shift, where we're rethinking how we do a wide variety of tasks, and that will include how we engage with our work life.
The other question is about big tech companies and social media platforms like Amazon, Facebook, Instagram, and what will be the role of social media and these platforms in the new normal? And when considering that they collect a huge amount of data throughout this COVID thing.
I think you're answering the question with the question almost, Radar. So we're going to see a dramatic transformation that's already been underway, exacerbate and continue. So, sort of while brick and mortar stores are closed, Amazon is booming, and Netflix is doing just great with people at home and using their services in different ways. And people have more time on their hands to engage with social media in a wide variety of ways. So I think that we already had a set of patterns in society developing in terms of change. And I think that we're going to see a sort of an exacerbation of the changes that we already saw.
And another question is about employer-employee relations. So how will you take on this, on what kind of a transformation will we be seeing on employee-employer relationship?
I think that that's a critical question to think about because, like so many other things, the exact needs of for employees is going to change. Obviously, we've seen a change in do we need employees to be at work, where waiters simply don't have jobs during the current crisis. But as we reemerge from the crisis, we're going to see sort of we're not going to see one day everybody goes back to work close to normal. We're going to see a slow change over time. And how do employers help their employees make it through the crisis when they may have less hours? How do they help employees deal with the fact that their jobs are going to be different in the future than they have been in the past? How do employees help their employers through dramatically greater flexibility? These are all critical questions. And whether you think about sort of a teacher of children, 5 to 18, who's now teaching some of what they teach online, or we think about a waiter in a restaurant where people have to be 6 feet apart for many months into the future. These are fundamentally different jobs, and I think that employers and employees both need to have sort of a graciousness and a generosity, but also flexibility for the organization and the employees to come out of this crisis as in the most healthy way possible.
Yeah, maybe I may humbly add creating trust and psychological safety throughout the organization, which will play a huge role in the upcoming years, I guess.
I think trust is absolutely critical.
Another question is about fiduciary responsibility or fiduciary duty, if I may say. We have been starting to challenge the short-termism and shareholder value maximization of the system. But with this COVID thing, will we be seeing a new era where we will be focusing on more shared value, more societal impacts rather than shareholder maximization?
I hope so. So I do see many organizations during the COVID crisis acting in very responsible ways. And I would hope that would continue into the future. I think people are going to be more aware of the fragility of the economy. They're going to be more aware of the interconnectedness of the economy. They're going to be more aware that a company does not exist independent of its community and broader society. So I would hope that organizations post-COVID will pay attention to their social responsibility to a significantly greater degree. That said, they're going to be doing so under threats to their own organization and focusing on the survival of their own organization. So maintaining a long-term perspective and thinking about the broader socioeconomic environment in which they act is going to be challenging, but yet important for our future.
How about the existing relations and the negotiations going through? How would COVID change the nature of existing relations, and how will the negotiations be different in the future?
So it's interesting that you asked that. So if I go back to the Great Recession, which I have already argued was not as important of an event as what we're going through right now. But when the Great Recession happened in 2008, 2009, much of my sort of consulting work on deal making and teaching negotiations dried up. But my consulting work didn't dry up. It simply changed. I had a different set of projects, and the new projects had to do with how do we deal with the fact that we already have a contract, but one party simply can't follow through on this contract. So you have company A saying, I can't follow through. Company B is thinking about suing. The only problem is if they sue, company A may well be bankrupt before they are able to collect anything. And I think that what we need in these kind of difficult disputes that are going to occur, in some cases due to no one's fault other than COVID, is more flexibility and more creativity to think about how do we solve what is our mutual problem? So, Sardar, if we have an agreement and I violate it and you sue me, but I go bankrupt, we both lose. Was there another solution that was less legalistic, that focused on sort of how do we go about finding a way forward that would be more helpful and more creative to both of us? That seems critically important. I recently ran into a fascinating story. So, and it's not my own story, but one of my colleagues who is a professor and the mother of 4, and used a particular child care facility. And the child care facility, a fairly small organization, collected their fees a month in advance. And when COVID happened, the child care facility wasn't prepared to, it had to be closed by government order. But meanwhile, they had already collected the fees, and they still had rent to pay, and they were still paying their employees. And some of the parents responded by saying, we want our money back immediately. Well, in fact, the child care facility it didn't have the funds to pay back all the parents immediately. Yet the parents were talking about legal action. Now, this does not sound like the right way for a child care facility and the customers of that organization to think about what kind of relationship do we want to have 3 months from now in a post-COVID period. And I think that we all want to think about this more creatively on how do we find sustainable strategies so that all parties can be better off moving forward.
Another question is about investors, how investors can stay rational in rational times of uncertainty. As we see, Dow Jones is doing pretty well. Much of the, for instance, stocks like Microsoft are really doing well. When you look at the numbers in the markets, it's obvious that there's not a serious thing going around.
So, Sardar, you know I'm a professor of decision-making and negotiation. I'm not a finance professor. But like all of us, I certainly think about that question myself. And I think that one of the results that happens from overconfidence is that people develop very strong opinions with inappropriate confidence that they know what organizations are going to succeed and which organizations are going to fail. And they forget about the fact that those views, if they're correct, have probably already been priced into the value of those securities. So when we want to buy or sell a stock, we need to consider the fact, for me to buy a stock, someone else has to sell it. And do I know more than them? And I think that means stepping back and being more cautious about being very active and thinking about how to reconfigure your portfolio. So I can tell you what I'm doing in terms of my investments, and it's going to sound shockingly boring, but I'm basically doing nothing. I haven't sold a stock. I haven't bought a stock. I haven't changed my portfolio throughout all of COVID. Obviously, I've lost money like most investors have, but I lost the money early on, and I don't think that sort of rapid response to my intuition to a particular threat or opportunity would have made more sense. So I would say be cautious about overreacting, because for you to have good insight, it requires someone else to have bad insight. And if you don't know, you might just want to hold to your current portfolio.
Yeah, there are a couple of questions about working from home. I will come back to them, but there's an interesting question about digitalization and digital transformation, if I may say. Lots of things are moving to digital, and will this bring more income inequality in the world, or we will see the gap widening more and more?
I don't know. So it sounds like a tough macroeconomic question that may be beyond my capabilities of answering fully. I hope digitalization allows us to get more information to more people. So I hope that that helps the world overall. But in terms of certainly much of what's happened in the digital economy has created greater inequality rather than solving problems of inequality. So I think that that's a very kind of mixed bag. I think it's good for the information to get out, and I think that we might need to rethink our tax systems. We might need to think about how our economy shares with those most in need.
Yeah, and there's a comment which reads like this: as Kahneman said too, it's time to think slow. So maybe these times we will use system 2 thinking, I guess.
I think that that's a terrific comment, and I would add to it that it's easier to think slow when you're not in the midst of the immediate need to make a decision. So if we think about the question that doctors confronted in Italy of who gets the ventilator when ventilators are scarce, okay, the wrong time to make that is at the moment of decision when the doctor is under pressure and the ventilator goes to either the 65-year-old or the 25-year-old, and they may in fact follow their emotional response. A far better time is for the hospital to think through what are our policies about how we're going to allocate scarce ventilators. And I think a very good strategy is to think about where the resources will do the most good. So whether it's sort of the hospital dealing with the doctor who might need to respond in a moment of crisis, or countries thinking about how different states are going to respond, or the World Health Organization thinking about how different countries will respond. Far better to think through these problems when an immediate decision isn't needed, so that we can think with a calmer, clearer, in the Kahneman version, slower mindset that system 2 thinking allows.
Yeah. Another question is from a college student. He is asking that, what is your take on management information systems on decision making throughout the leadership decision process? And maybe we can take it to a step higher. We have been talking about big data and analytics and just predictive analytics for a while. So is it a good time to tap into those sources?
Absolutely. So many decisions are going to be made by algorithms moving forward rather than human judgment. And I think that that's overall a great effect. It comes with concerns. It comes with the potential for misuse of information. It comes with the potential for manipulation. But overall, there are many decisions where machine learning and artificial intelligence can guide us to wiser decisions than we can make on our own. It's a trend that's going to continue. Obviously, many forecasters predict that we're going to be in driverless cars in the not too distant future. And that's going to require the computerization of decision making to a remarkable degree. So I think that, again, this is a trend that was already in the works, and I fully expect that to continue in the post-COVID period as well.
Just a couple of questions about your book's topic, the experimentation thing.
Yeah.
At Harvard Business Review, we ran a cover story about experimentation, I think 2 months ago, and it was really an interesting perspective. So what is the use of experimentation in business context? When we say about experiment and experimentation, it reminds me of a laboratory where people with white robes are just trying to do some scientific things. So what is experimentation for a business context?
Thank you for thank you for the question. First of all, let me clarify that when we use the word experiments, we don't mean try it and see if it works, which is a sort of a common layperson use of the term. When we say experimentation, we mean having 2 different versions of the same task, where we manipulate one factor at a time so that we can find out which is a better way of doing things. So imagine that since we've been talking about technology and online activity, imagine that you have a digital platform of some type, and you have an idea about how to make it better. And let's assume you have 100,000 customers who use your digital platform. But one of your employees has an idea about a significant change to make to the platform. you could either use your judgment to decide yes or no on whether you're going to listen to their advice, or you could try it on 1,000 random people, while you have another 1,000 people who use the existing system, and have them both run at over the same period and actually find out which one's more effective. And in the digital economy, we find tech firms using experimentation as a amazingly simple and superior way of finding out what works to a quite dramatic degree. We think that leaders in the future need to develop the tools of experimentation so that they can find out what works rather than trust their intuition when the experimentation can provide far better answers than their intuition. If we go back to Kahneman System 1, System 2, our intuition is what the System 1 version that Kahneman critiques, while experimentation in many cases is the very best version of System 2 thinking that we could possibly develop.
A couple of questions, as I mentioned, is about remote work. One of them is the psychological part of it. I think lots of our friends are come to a certain point of burnout because of all this digital work and overload. So any advice on handling the emotional side of this?
So I find myself wanting to tell my friends who want to have social Zooms that I'm not very good at social contact by Zoom beyond 20 minutes. So early on in the crisis, I found myself in lots of hour-long Zooms where for the second half of it, I really wanted the call to graciously end. I think that it's completely reasonable without offending the other person to make it clear that that there's a limited amount of time for the social contact under this new form. And in the business context, that may be facilitated by sending a very clear memo in advance of the online contact that makes the online contact more efficient. So I'm perfectly happy with the form of talking to you that we're engaging in right now, Serdar, but 3 hours of it, I'm not sure. So I think that thinking about how to organize things so that they have as much content as possible within certain constraints may be a very healthy adaptation to this new environment.
Okay, I have a final and conversation killer type of a question. Are you ready for it?
Absolutely.
Why are people buying that much toilet rolls?
So I think it's selfishness, and I think it's risk aversion. So people just have this enormous fear of running out. And I think it's unfortunate because, again, we shouldn't have people who just can't sort of find any supply at all. And I think that wise retailers are limiting the purchases to even out this the allocation. Again, this goes back to how do we allocate scarce resources, whether it's ventilators and masks across countries or toilet papers to different people within Istanbul. I think we want to think about what would be a fair allocation system on whatever goods happen to be scarce.
Yeah. I'm really amazed the behavioral science behind all those purchasing behaviors and purchasing activities. So, Max, thank you very much. We have come to the end of our conversation. It's always a pleasure to talk to you. Hope you and your family will be healthy and safe, and hope to see you soon in person in Istanbul again.
That would be wonderful. Thank you so much, Serdar, for inviting me to talk with you and your audience.
Dear guests, thanks for participating in the live stream. We will be hosting many important and distinguished figures, thought leaders throughout this COVID era. And please keep watching us, and please stay tuned and have a safe, healthy, and great week. Thank you very much.